Until they bring the streetcars back. Chapter 5. I hit study hall a few minutes early on Monday and noticed Gretchen huddled in her seat, and even though I'd made up my mind to have nothing more to do with her, I couldn't help turning around as I sat down. Did your dad punish you? She stared into her lap and acted like she didn't hear me at first. I would have thought her I would have thought her a real dog except for something pathetic about her, like when you see a lost fawn standing in the rain or something. A dog tried to look attractive, like wearing the right clothes and fixing her hair, but Gretchen Letterman didn't even try. She glanced at me like she was surprised I noticed her, and then looked down like she was talking to the floor. Yes, he hurt me. I didn't know what to say. You're kidding. But I knew right off that she didn't know how, that she was different from anyone I'd ever known. What did he do? I can't tell you. He'll find out I told. How's he going to do that, for crying out loud? I laughed. I'd never squeal. She glanced at me, then sat there staring at the floor. If I'm not on the curb when he pulls up, he whips me when we get home. He does? Gosh, what if it isn't your fault? It doesn't matter. She sneaked another look at me and then stared into her lap. I'm not supposed to talk to you. To me? To any boy. He forbids it. Miss Whaleman stood as the bell rang, and I turned in my seat. Maybe she made up stories to get kids' attentions or something. Like a spy, I glanced across the auditorium to Lola, and she was risking seventh period by chewing gum in class and trying to look like she wasn't, but I could tell. Serving my time in Kirschbach's seventh period all week was like walking through a minefield. If it wasn't for D.B. Sanderson, Mr. Kirschbach would win first prize for the teacher who had no idea what was going on in his classroom. A short, stocky guy with olive skin, dark, puffy bags under his eyes, and black, oily hair. He taught history and Latin. At least that's what the classes were called, but actually the subject was how to keep a bumbling teacher so distracted you don't have to do any work in his screwball class. Kids were always pulling something in his seventh period, and that's what worried me. He had a torture machine, a big wind-up alarm clock he'd set on his desk that divide the hour into bleak, agonizing seconds while kids were wasting away. He'd lounge in a magical wooden chair that had rollers and swiveled and tipped back like a rocker, and he seemed to enjoy ramrodding the hour of detention over the school's cut-ups. The kids would sucker him out of the room for a few minutes by having someone outside the class call him to the office on the intercom, and then they'd hide the clock and set the alarm, and 5 minutes after he was back, the alarm would go off at the bottom of the wastebasket or buried in one of his drawers, and he'd go nuts trying to find it. Or someone would loosen the spring tension on his chair, and when he'd fall asleep, which he did a lot in seventh period, he'd crash over backwards like a load of coal onto the floor. Whenever he realized he'd been bamboozled, he'd fly into a rage and give everyone another week of seventh period. And if that happened, I'd be off the football team for good, and all because I talked to Gretchen Letterman for 3 seconds. I sweated out through seventh period all week, and nobody pulled anything, and I basically forgot about Gretch the Wretch, except for a few times when I had to avoid her in the halls. I never want her to know I was ducking from her or hurt her feelings or anything, so you have to be good at it and make it look natural, like the second you spot her coming, you go 90 degrees into the first door as if you have a class there or something. On Thursday, I almost ducked into the girls' can. Mr. Finley, a short, white-haired man, stood checking an order book at the back of the store while I carried boxes of groceries out the back. He wore wire-rimmed glasses, and his eyebrows looked like hairy caterpillars that seemed to move across his forehead when he talked. With his green celluloid visor and his bibbed apron, he reminded me of an old Geppetto. He really did. The guy who made Pinocchio. Geppetto, that's how you say that. You need to stop at Prior Liquor for 2 orders, Cal, Finley said. as I came in from the truck. Okay, anything else the morning? Ugh. Mr. Finley flipped the order book closed and looked over his glasses at me. That's everything I can remember. Are you saving your money? Yeah, I am, but I don't dare tell my dad I am saving for a car. You know how he feels about cars. Yes, yes, the enemy of the streetcar, but you must save your money for the future. Do you realize that a nickel you save today becomes a dollar when you have to earn later on? Yeah, but I feel lousy when I can never drive on dates and things. I always have to get a ride with someone else and pile 50 kids in a car. I folded one of the collapsible wooden boxes and stacked it with the others. I think most of my friends think we're too poor to have a car, and it's hard to explain. If I told them the truth, they'd think my dad was loony. How long have you been working for me now? He asked. A woman came through the front door, ringing the little brass bells Finley had fastened to the door frame. I counted in my head. Over a year. I started in July. Well, I've been thinking I should give you a raise. Say 5 cents. That makes 55 cents an hour. But you have to promise to save some of it and not just for a car. He headed toward the front of the store, and I picked up the last box and backed out of the door. Gosh, thanks, Mr. Finley. Thanks a lot. I enjoyed tooling around the neighborhood in the 46 Plymouth paneled truck when I had extra time because it was the only time I got to drive, basically. Steve taught me how in the 39 Chevy, and sometimes he'd let me drive when we were goofing around on a Friday night and something, and he got tired of me looking under the hood of the Stovebolt 680 horse inline engine. Finley's truck had a straight 695 horse that I almost wore out memorizing. When I pulled up to the corner beside Finley's Market, a streetcar came from the west and stopped for a man and a woman. It was my father's car. He'd driven the Grand Mississippi line for 10 of the 29 years he's worked for the company. I honked and waved as the streetcar started across the intersection, and my dad, seeing me in the truck, started clanging the bells like crazy, and I couldn't help but notice how happy and proud he looked. Like what he was doing was awfully important, and it really was, because what would we do without someone to drive the streetcars? And everybody would be walking or hitchhiking, and crippled people would be dragging down the sidewalks and never get anywhere on time. I had a regular delivery at 1493 Summit, the fancy boulevard where the rich people lived, but first I had to pick up the orders at the Prior Lake store, something Mr. Finley had worked out with Sid, the owner of the place, and for this extra service I'd get a tip. I pulled in the alley and backed up to the brick building. When I jumped onto the loading dock and slid open the heavy metal door, Sid was standing in the storeroom with a clipboard checking inventory. He glanced up at me with the stub of a cigarette dangling from the side of his mouth, like he thought he was Humphrey Bogart or something, and the smoke made him squint through his right eye. Two liquor boxes waited near the back door with yellow receipts tucked into the tops. These are the two, I said. Sid was kind of an undernourished looking guy with stooped shoulders and crossed eyes. I don't want to sound mean or anything because it's not his fault, but I could never tell for sure where the guy was looking. I really couldn't, and I could never look him in the eye for very long because I caught myself trying to figure out which eye was on me. Yeah, that's it. What happened to you guys last night? Got your asses kicked. I picked up the case of Chapin and Gore bourbon. Yeah, I know. I didn't get to play. Missed practice all week. I hauled the liquor into the truck and hustled back. Screwing around too much at school, huh? Sid said and looked at me. At least I thought he looked at me, but he could have been reading a calendar on the other side of the room. I picked up the second case and headed for the truck. No, talking in study hall, I said, and then muttered to myself, to a freaky girl. Though I sat on the bench all night, it irked me just as much that we lost to Harding. Geez, a team we should have slaughtered, and we all went home with a 6-0 loss stenciled on our prats. In the next couple weeks, I managed to avoid Gretchen by getting to study hall just before the bell and blasting out of there the second it was over without looking back. Sometimes out of the corner of my eye, I noticed her watching, just staring, like she was sizing me up for something. It was spooky. I could feel her eyeballs on my back and my neck, And even though I pretended to be studying like mad, I was squirming like a worm on a hook, and I prayed she wasn't thinking I could be her boyfriend or anything like that. Once, when I got there too early, she touched my shoulder, and I turned without thinking and looked at her. She opened her mouth like she was going to say something, but the bell saved me, and when the hour was over, I bombed out the side door.